Quinn, you've written a fascinating and, I have to say, frankly, disturbing piece for the New Statesman magazine on the rise of the new tech right and how the cult of IQ became a toxic ideology in Silicon Valley and beyond. All very optimistic stuff. Thanks for that. You begin this piece by exploring the concept of meritocracy and its evolution since the 1950s. And I think we should start there by just kind of defining these terms and introducing this subject. Could you give us a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about this idea of meritocracy? And how have the implications of that concept changed since the 1950s, where you start this piece?
Sure. Well, the term actually was coined by a labor politician and sociologist, Michael Young, in a kind of speculative science fiction novel, interestingly enough, that he wrote that was published in 1958. And in the novel, the premise is that the way that the elite would be selected in the future would not be through their connections or their kind of class status, but through their ability. And their intelligence, above all, would be the kind of criteria that people were selected by to become basically the governing class. So the book sets up this fascinating situation where you get a kind of a sorting out of the population according to their intelligence and a seeming kind of perfection of a technocratic rule of society until, in a kind of a twist ending, there's a revolt of a populist party led by women in this case that overthrows the meritocratic elite and creates a new, more kind of egalitarian system. So the term meritocracy now has entered, of course, our mainstream conversations, but still I think has this implication of the kind of the complement to a democracy where everyone has one vote is a kind of a selection of the governing class according to skill. And since then, there's been endless conversations about whether this is good, whether it's bad, whether it's actually happening, whether it's blocked, whether there are sort of unintended consequences of a system like this, as suggested by the novel itself. And the IQ conversation really sort of enters this larger meritocracy debate, I would say.
And you have this term IQ fetishism to talk about this idea of IQ and sorting people into these sort of cognitive stratospheres. Where do you see that debate really start to come back to prominence? So that the Michael Young book, I think, is in the 1950s. Where do you trace then the resurgence of these ideas more recently?
Well, I mean, I think it's worth very briefly sort of remembering where the IQ thing came from. Originally, it was the IQ tests were introduced to sort of select an officer class and delegitimize people who were entering the armed forces who might not be able to reason well enough to be incorporated into more like high responsibility positions. So it was originally intended to kind of do that sorting in terms of a military that was going to be fighting in the First World War in this case. It comes back in the 1950s and 60s, as you say, kind of as part of the shift to what was then for the first time being called a knowledge economy. So if you think about people not as primarily going into the mines or the factories or the battlefield, but doing things like white collar work, teaching, becoming lawyers, becoming stock traders, and so on, this was a kind of a new mandate for education. We're educating and finding talented people who can do these kind of mental tasks rather than physical tasks. So in the 60s, it really became a debate, especially in the UK, around streaming and whether or not you should create a universal education system, and that the old model of sort of public schools was actually suppressing merit and keeping people who could be more talented out of the kind of ruling or governing class. So in the UK, that's really where the debate picks up in the 60s. In the US, it's around, somewhat dormant, but really takes off in the 1990s. And the signature sort of extraordinary flag post there is the publication of this book called The Bell Curve by Charles Murray, who is a kind of libertarian think tanker, and Richard J. Hertenstein, who is a Harvard psychologist. They write this sort of 800-page dense social science treaty and it becomes a bestseller. It sells 400,000 copies. It's on the New York Times bestseller list for months and months and months. And it reopens this debate about IQ, specifically around the question of race and whether or not there are group differences in IQ, whether or not it's the case that groups defined as racial are somehow also defined by a kind of average, lower or higher level of IQ. And most importantly, whether or not the kind of 1960s ideology of racial liberation and egalitarianism had kind of skewed the outcomes such that more talented people from high IQ racial groups in their mind, things the whites, East Asians, Ashkenazi Jews, were being sort of kept out of power, kept out of meritocratic uplift in favor of lower IQ groups such as African Americans and Latinos. So it was an explosive topic that was, extremely disputed by experts. The American Psychology Association published a huge refutation of the findings of the bell curve. But it opened a conversation that sort of hasn't gone away. And this new tech right that the piece is built around needs to be seen as part of the kind of ongoing furore that opened up in the mid 1990s.
One of the things that really struck me about reading this piece, and as you talked there about the bell curve, was how phenomenally popular that book was, and how these ideas that we might like to think about as being kind of really on the fringes, really sort of like extreme theories, were clearly palatable and interesting to a large audience. I mean, is that still part of the dynamic around IQ fetishism, discussions of intelligence, this idea that there is some sort of hereditary aspect of this
Oh,
of this
absolutely.
idea?
I mean, the IQ fetishism of the right wing of the kind of tech world in Silicon Valley would be almost to a person, and I almost said to a man, because we are talking about a conversation like really dominated almost exclusively by men for reasons that we maybe will talk about in a second, is that they would see intelligence as largely hereditary and genetically determined in a way that, as they understand it, the kind of quote unquote woke egalitarian ideology that we have as a legacy of the 1960s keeps on trying to suppress. So, well, their chief complaint is, I would say, and why it was so explosive in the 90s and still is, it's got two sides. On the one hand, there's a kind of pushback against what they see as government overreach. So there's a feeling that, especially affirmative action programs that try to, put people from underrepresented groups kind of at the head of the queue or create quotas for minority or underrepresented groups, are skewing the kind of the quality of people in occupations and the people who are rising to the top of government and the corporate world. So there's a kind of anti-meritocratic, as they see it, thrust to the policies that came out of the 1960s. Second, because they, in many cases, feel like there are some people that, let's say, left-hand side of the bell curve of the IQ distribution, who are kind of not salvageable as productive members of society, and who indeed do need to be kind of like warehoused or incarcerated, that this is kind of another part of the what they see as like left-wing progressive ideology is repressing. So the fact that there are incorrigible parts of the population, and they do just need to be like sequestered from the rest of the community. Thirdly, the question of immigration becomes really volatile here, because the argument, if you believe, as they do, that there are kind of group differences defined by racial groups in IQ, then if you're letting in people from groups that you understand to be low IQ, you see this as producing what they call a kind of downward pressure on overall intelligence, or what they call a dysgenic rather than eugenic tendency. If groups with overall lower IQs, they see it, are having more children and are coming into the country in larger numbers, then a lot of these people on the tech right see this as kind of a secular trend towards, dumbing down the United States, causing it to lose its edge economically, and causing a kind of a perverse outcome where state policies lead to kind of a worst population quality. So it's all, I mean, it is really repellent way of looking at humans, sort of sorting them into these airtight groups that every other scientist would say they don't belong in. That these sort of hard borders of racial difference are culturally constructed, they're arbitrary, they don't have the kind of solidity that people on the tech right or IQ fetishists attribute to them. And they critics say, and I would put myself in that group too, that this use of kind of social science rhetoric is a way to kind of reintroduce just plain old racism by the back door and to kind of legitimize it and give it the gloss of kind of academic rigor, where in fact it is just a reinforcement of pre-existing stereotypes.
If we follow those beliefs through to their logical endpoint and the sort of the vision of what a society ordered by this idea of IQ would look like, I mean, where does that get us? What is the end state that these individuals believe should
Mm-hmm.
follow from this ordering of
Well,
society?
interestingly enough, it's a little bit like the vision that Michael Young had of the future, in the sense that you have a kind of hand in glove cooperation of the government with the scientific establishment that figures out who the highest achieving people are and then places them in kind of the positions of power or decision making. It is sort of literally a eugenic policy in the sense that it's an enlightened government enlightened by race science. The interesting thing about the tech right, and here I would include Nick Bostrom, who was at Oxford, who was a central philosopher of the effective altruism movement, Dominic Cummings, former advisor to Boris Johnson, and Richard Hanania, who's become a kind of sensation in the United States for the revelations of him writing pseudonymous alternative right tracts in the earlier 2000s. But for all three of these people, anyway, as I talk about in the piece, there was a real fascination about 15 years ago with China. The feeling was that China was taking seriously the idea of general intelligence. They were allowing briefly for kind of large scale DNA gathering to create databases of a potential kind of future elite who could perhaps be culled out of the larger population and, I don't know, encouraged to reproduce given special bonuses. I'm not sure what they saw as the end game. But the interesting thing about that was there was a kind of an envious look at a place like People's Republic of China for not having the kind of guardrails around intervention into reproduction, into the kind of the flouting of democratic egalitarianism that this would involve if you kind of genetically select out a specific class for improvement. But that's no coincidence. I mean, there's one country in the world that took seriously the limits to growth report in the 1970s about the need to curb population growth, and that was China. The one-child policy showed that they were willing to make very drastic interventions into their own population for particular demographic outcomes. So there was some reason for these tech folks, when they were still in their kind of China-philic phase in the early 2010s, to look kind of longingly at a place that had more dictatorial kind of capacity to transform the behavior of its citizens.
I mean, they sound almost like there are echoes there in the attraction that sort of white nationalists, white supremacists find in modern Russia under Putin, a sort of
Mm-hmm.
envy of if only we could structure our own society more along these lines, which is pretty chilling and disturbing. I mean, you mentioned there that these ideas and this revival of IQ fetishism is really dominated by men, and you talk in the article about specific individuals who are really playing an outsized role in funding and attempting to mainstream these ideas. I mean, who are the key figures to know about here and to really be focusing on?
Well, I mean, I think Charles Murray, who was the original co-author of that book, The Bell Curve, in the 90s, continues to be active and continues to write books that are published on trade presses about the kind of the science of race and gender. Gender because the sort of assumption of this group is that women have a lower average IQ as a group than men, which, just as the racial kind of results, helps to reinforce conservative and reactionary racial stereotypes. So this apparently scientific evidence is used to reinforce the idea that women's role is more private and reproductive rather than active and public. The funder who's worked closely with Charles Murray, who I think is a good name to know, is Harlan Crow, which is a name right out of a sort of Cormac McCarthy novel, who was the heir to one of the United States' biggest real estate fortunes. His father was Trammell Crow, who was actually interestingly involved in the early stages with the revitalization of Canary Wharf. In my book, he shows up in a different context, which is, talking about turning the Docklands into a financial center, as they ended up doing. So Harlan Crow has been in the news recently also for giving all kinds of gifts and unreported vacations and perks to Clarence Thomas, one of the members of the American Supreme Court, and got his fingerprints in a lot of this stuff. So he's supported the creation of this new sort of startup private educational institution called the University of Austin that promotes its roots in what was called the intellectual dark web, a few years ago, and promotes the investigation of quote unquote forbidden knowledge, which often means looking at the scientific reality of race and gender difference. The male factor also comes in through the influence of what's called evolutionary psychology, which is also very big in this world. The idea that we still have kind of an important part of our brains that are hardwired for our lives, surviving on the savannah where the men went out and fought or hunted big game, and the women tended the children and, picked berries and so on. Again, also some very hackneyed cliches about what early man's life was like, which then get reinforced with this idea that we still have those disproportionate levels of aggression in men and propensity to care in women that we only kind of deny at our own risk. So interestingly, a lot of the stuff that's coming out of the tech right is about kind of deferring to science, either social science or human sciences or even life sciences, as having the kind of the key to social organization, in a way that they see the mainstream as sort of too quickly dismissing. There's a feeling that the idea that race is a social construct, gender is a social construct, reality is a social construct has become the kind of mainstream ideology of higher education and the Democratic Party and so on. And so they're pushing back against that and saying, no, in the end, we need to build politics and society on the bedrock of nature. And who knows about nature? Well, scientists know about nature. So let's turn to the science, which is interesting because in the United States anyway, in the Trump years, there was a big discourse about trusting the science, which was assumed to be kind of a progressive or, center left position to take. But in fact, the right wing has been just as interested in trusting the science, perhaps more so. And they actually see it as a way to push back against ideas of human equality. For them, science preaches the lesson of difference and hierarchy and kind of incorrigibility and unameliorability, meaning that if you do listen to the science, you accept that there will always be more powerful groups and less powerful groups. And surprise, surprise, the contents of those groups is very similar to those that have defined, modern life for the last several centuries. So it's very pessimistic and fatalistic as a political position.
Do these arguments take account of existing structural privilege? I mean, it strikes me one of the things listening to these ideas is it really does help to justify a worldview where you deserve, just through your own genes, all the advantages that you as an already privileged member of society might enjoy. I mean, how do these arguments engage with or not the idea that some people just start very far
Hmm.
down the road in terms of the advantages and the systems and the structural the structure of the society they're born
There
into.
is that. I mean, in America, the baseball metaphor that's used is being born on third base, right? And only having one base to run to get home. There is some of that, but I think less than the way it kind of validates pre-existing class privilege is how it is inserted in this really specific and actually very strange world historical moment in on the American West Coast in Silicon Valley. So for in this period from the end of the global financial crisis and or the outbreak of the global financial crisis in 2008, really until let's say the pandemic in 2020, you had kind of a decade plus where interest rates were so low, investor interest was so high that people with the most slender ideas of their own could arrive in Silicon Valley and Palo Alto area and start shopping around their idea of what they wanted to do and suddenly have millions, tens of millions of dollars of valuation on their harebrained idea, just on the premise that if it paid out, it could make the venture capitalists who were behind it 10 times more money, 100 times more money. So it was worth it for them to put large amounts of money on every little bet. What I think that did was it produced this sort of illusion of genius, right? It produced this sense on the behalf of the often very young people, usually young men who were part of that world, that they were like uniquely endowed with some kind of special insight that nobody else could have thought about the idea of making like Uber for skateboards, so they must have something that is special. And every time someone criticized them and said, you're just on the froth of like a tech bubble or your idea is dumb, then they would just say, you're resentful of my genius. My genius is actually something that is inherent to me and all my friends here. So the individualism of the tech bubble, I think, produced this sense of being decontextualized, as if you didn't actually, arrive to where you were through collaboration, through the kind of work of a collective, through, let's say, building a workforce who actually needed to produce the object. It was just a person and an idea. So I think that idea of the lone genius was both kind of reinforced and given reinforcement by these notions of kind of inbuilt hereditary um, intelligence that then produced a kind of a social scientific scaffolding and a kind of armor for people to hold up against themselves whenever they were criticized from outside. And this you can really just see this on the blogs and kind of listservs that were popular in that period, the 2010s. I mentioned some of them in the piece: Less Wrong, Slate Star, Kodaks. They repeat over and over this feeling of a kind of small, embattled genius minority who everyone else is resentful of and only wants to dispossess because they were not endowed with inbuilt and inborn um, advantages cognitively that these people were born in. The fact that it's all happening online too, right? I mean, you can be a 110-pound weakling and yet be like a titan, right? Either, let's be honest, in the video game that you play or in the valuation of the company that you have helped to found. So I think it was a perfect storm for this idea of kind of the genetic genius that as it fades, you can predictably see people sort of clawing to try to keep that position. But high interest rates are a hard dragon to fight in any circumstance.
I mean, one thing that strikes me is a lot of these individuals are now at the forefront of these really important emerging technologies like
Mm-hmm.
AI, which are going to play a very important role in our future. How do these kind of beliefs influence where they see those technologies going? I mean, you end your piece with quite a dystopian vision of how this technology could be used in all of our features in a society ordered in
Mm-hmm.
terms of intelligence.
Yeah. So I end with this indeed kind of chilling vision from this person named Curtis Yarvin, who blogged under the name Mencius Moldbug, who is perfect for the story because he was kind of plucked out of his high school as a youngster by a program that was out searching for high IQ individuals. It was set up by the psychologist named Julian Stanley, specifically as a counterweight to what he saw as the leveling quality of Great Society programs. So Yarvin really drank the Kool-Aid quite early. Is a kind of like, you have to see him as kind of a Jonathan Swift type, like satirist at times. So I think he can be taken at his word in a way he's certainly not always meaning to. But he's symptomatic. And one of the interesting kind of chilling things he suggests is like, once work is manual labor is automated, and AI has become advanced enough to take over most human tasks, we'll be left with this problem of surplus populations. So his argument is you just sort of more or less incarcerate people in their homes, but then give them very advanced kind of virtual reality interfaces that they can play on all day long, and thereby like pacify them and reduce the chance of a popular revolt of the kind that ends Michael Young's 1958 novel. So there is definitely an undercurrent of this IQ talk in the AI conversation, in the sense that many of these same members of the kind of tech right see themselves as geniuses. Therefore, the only thing that they fear is something that could be smarter than them, which like by definition must not be human, because they're the smartest humans. So it might be something, however, that they could program. So if they could create artificial intelligence through their application of their own intelligence, augment it with the capabilities of the world's best processors and chips and so on, then you're in a territory of what is often called like the singularity. And there's, I think, two things that I would say about that. One is, I think that the idea of AI as the takeover of the killer robots is very easy to dismiss, and I tend to dismiss it myself. But the idea of AI taking over the very kind of white collar jobs that are essential to the knowledge economy from the 1960s to the present is much easier to imagine, right? I think a lot of people do have kind of bullshit jobs, as David Graeber would say, that are just kind of making bad PowerPoints, writing silly presentations, writing up grants and reports, that actually AI could probably do pretty well, or almost as well as people do. So the question then about what we can do with our society once those kind of automatable tasks have been taken over is one where I think more than ever, the qualities that are not measured in IQ tests are necessary. Because I think IQ tests indeed sort of measure the kind of things that AIs can be good at, the kind of spatial reasoning and sequential reasoning. So the creativity that we will need to figure out a world once we've automated those things is one where this fixation on IQ won't be of much help anymore.